The snow started falling on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883, and by Wednesday noon, Ingrid Halvorsen couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The wind screamed through the valley east of Bozeman, Montana territory, driving ice crystals horizontal across the prairie like buckshot. Inside what neighbors called Halvorsen's foolish contraption, she sat at her table with her 7-year-old daughter and listened to the timbers groan overhead. She'd built her barn directly over the cabin, one continuous structure with the livestock stalls wrapping 3 sides around her living space. Every settler within 15 miles had told her she was wasting lumber. Now, while their wood piles buried themselves under 4-foot drifts, Ingrid walked 8 feet from her kitchen to her firewood stack without ever stepping outside. The thermometer nailed to her doorframe read -32 degrees Fahrenheit. The blizzard had come early, catching most folks with half their winter preparations undone. Her neighbor Thomas Brennan had laughed at her construction plans back in June. He'd homesteaded his claim 3 years before she arrived. His woodshed stood 40 yards from his cabin door, a perfectly reasonable distance in July, but a death sentence in whiteout conditions. She'd arrived in Montana territory in the spring of '82, a widow with a daughter and $60 in coin. Her husband had died of pneumonia in Minnesota before they could make the journey west together. She'd sold everything, bought a wagon, and driven it herself across Dakota territory. She'd filed her homestead claim on 160 acres in the Gallatin Valley, land nobody wanted because it sat in a wind channel between 2 mountain ridges. The first winter she'd lived in a dugout, nearly dying 3 times from cold. The second winter, a half-finished cabin with gaps between the logs, burning through her entire wood pile by February. That's when she'd started thinking differently. She'd grown up in northern Norway, where her grandfather had kept his goats in a stone byre attached directly to the cottage. The animal heat had kept the family warm through months of darkness. She'd remembered that. Now, if you'd asked folks about practical construction, they would have pointed you toward men like Samuel Dietrich or Robert McKenna, settlers who'd built solid structures and survived multiple winters. Dietrich had come from Ohio with his wife and 4 sons, knew carpentry, had access to a sawmill. McKenna was a former railroad worker who'd saved enough to start his own place, a practical man who didn't waste motion or materials. Both of them had examined Ingrid's plans when she'd shown them in town that spring, and both had told her the same thing. She was building wrong. "You're putting your animals that close to where you sleep?" Dietrich had said, sitting outside the general store with his sons around him. He was 43 years old, square-shouldered, and spoke with the certainty of someone who'd never been proven wrong about construction. "The smell alone will drive you out, and the moisture from their breath will rot your timbers in 2 years. McKenna had been more direct. "It's a fire trap," he'd said. "One kicked lantern in the straw, and your whole place goes up with you inside it. You separate your structures for safety. That's common sense." He'd built his own barn 75 feet from his cabin, connected by a rope strung between the buildings so he could find his way in whiteout conditions. He'd considered it the height of winter preparedness. There'd been a third skeptic, though she hadn't known it at the time. Margaret Caulfield ran the boarding house in town, had lived in Montana for 12 years, and had survived 2 husbands. She'd made her living knowing what worked and what killed people, and when she'd heard about Ingrid's plans through the network of women who kept the valley functioning, she'd ridden out to the Halvorsen place herself. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," Margaret had said, standing in Ingrid's half-built cabin in May of '83. She was 51 years old, thin as a lodgepole pine, and spoke in a voice that carried over wind. "But I buried my first husband after he got lost between his cabin and his barn in a blizzard. 15 feet. That's all the distance there was. They found him frozen solid 3 feet from his own door. He'd gotten turned around." Ingrid had listened to all of them. She'd nodded, thanked them for their concern, and kept building exactly as she'd planned. The structure she'd designed looked wrong from every conventional angle. Most settlers built square cabins with the door facing south, then constructed their barns as separate buildings 30 to 100 feet away. Ingrid had started with a rectangular foundation, 24 feet wide by 40 feet long, and built everything as one continuous unit. The cabin occupied the north end, a single room 16 by 24 feet with a stone fireplace on the north wall. The barn portion wrapped around the cabin's other three sides like a horseshoe, creating a 5-foot wide corridor of stalls and storage that you accessed through 2 interior doors. The livestock stalls ran along the east and west walls, 4 on each side, large enough for cows or horses. The south end, opposite the fireplace, held her woodpile, stacked 8 feet high and running the full width of the building. Above everything, a common roof sloped from a peak over the cabin down to walls that stood 7 feet high on the barn sides. The hay storage filled the entire attic space, accessible through a hatch in the cabin ceiling. It was, by any standard measure, completely backward. But here's what Ingrid had understood that the others hadn't. Montana Territory in the 1880s killed people through isolation, not just cold. The average winter temperature from November through February ran -10 to -20 degrees. Blizzards came fast, visibility dropped to 0, and people died 10 feet from safety because they couldn't find the door. She'd read about a family near Helena who'd starved to death with a full pantry because they couldn't reach their root cellar during a week-long storm. The husband had tried, gotten lost, frozen. The wife hadn't risked it. They'd found them in April. If you'd like to see more stories about frontier innovation and forgotten survival techniques, join the others who are working to preserve this knowledge. Hit that subscribe button so these accounts don't disappear into history, like so many others already have. Ingrid had spent the summer of '83 building, and the valley had watched. She'd harvested logs from the foothills, bought hardware from town with money she'd earned washing clothes for railroad workers. She'd hired a man named Chen Wei, a former railroad worker, to help with the heavy lifting. "This design is very strange," he'd said in careful English, looking at her drawings. He was from Guangdong province, had survived the worst of the railroad construction through the Rockies. "In my village, we keep animals separate." "Your village didn't have Montana winters," Ingrid had replied. They'd worked through July and August, raising walls and setting the massive ridge beam. The beam itself was a single lodgepole pine trunk, 32 feet long and 16 inches thick. Getting it into position had required a tripod and a block and tackle. Chen had shown her a rope technique from the railroad, and together they'd lifted what 3 men had said couldn't be done by 2 people. The firewood storage had been the most controversial part. Ingrid had designed a space that held 16 cords of wood, stacked in rows with air gaps between them for drying. The wood sat on a raised platform of split logs, keeping it 8 inches off the dirt floor. Above it, she'd left a 3-foot gap before the hay storage began, with ventilation holes drilled through the wall to prevent moisture buildup. The entire south wall was double-layered, 2 rows of logs with a 4-inch airspace between them, packed with dried grass for insulation. It meant you walked through the barn corridor, opened a door, and found yourself standing in front of a winter's worth of fuel that never got wet and never had snow blown onto it. Samuel Dietrich had come by in September to examine the finished structure. He'd walked around it twice, gone inside, stood in the cabin, and looked at the interior doors leading to the livestock areas. His face had done something complicated. "It's well built," he'd finally said, and you could hear him forcing the words out. "But you'll regret it come January. The smell, the moisture, the risk. Mark my words." Robert McKenna had been more succinct. "You've built yourself a coffin," he'd said. "All it takes is one spark." Margaret Caulfield had brought bread and butter when she'd visited after the structure was complete. She'd inspected everything carefully, professional in her assessment. "It's solid work," she'd said, sitting at Ingrid's new table, watching her daughter play in the corner. "But winter is something else. Winter doesn't care how good your carpentry is." Ingrid had thanked them all and stocked her wood. The blizzard had started during breakfast. Ingrid's daughter, Anna, had been eating porridge and asking about school. The valley had organized a schoolhouse that year, and Anna had been attending whenever weather permitted. Now Ingrid looked at the white wall beyond her window and knew Anna wouldn't be going anywhere for days, maybe weeks. The snow was already a foot deep at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the wind was building. By noon, she couldn't see the fence posts 20 feet from her door. By evening, the temperature had dropped to -18. By the next morning, it was -32 and still falling. Inside what everyone had called the foolish contraption, Ingrid went about her day. She milked her cow through the door in the east wall, walked 8 feet from her kitchen area to the stall. The cow, a placid shorthorn named Greta, provided 2 gallons of milk that Ingrid strained into crocks. She fed her 3 chickens through the door in the west wall, collected 4 eggs. She climbed the ladder to the hay storage and forked down enough feed for the cow and her 2 horses, a bay gelding and a gray mare she used for plowing. All of this took her 20 minutes, and she never once put on her heavy coat. The firewood sat in its rack at the south end of the barn corridor, 60 feet from her fireplace in a straight line. She loaded her arms with split pine and cedar, enough for 3 hours of burning, and carried it back through the corridor to the cabin door. The corridor temperature hovered around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep the wood dry, but not so cold that her hands went numb in the 10 seconds it took to load up. The animal heat, exactly as she'd planned, kept the barn above freezing. Their breath and body warmth, rising through the structure, prevented the catastrophic cold that killed livestock in separate buildings. Thomas Brennan, her nearest neighbor, had a different morning. He'd woken to find snow piled 3 feet against his cabin door. His woodshed stood 40 yards west, and he couldn't see it. The previous night he'd burned through the wood he'd kept inside, maybe enough for another 6 hours if he was careful. His children, 3 boys aged 4, 6, and 9, sat wrapped in blankets by a fire that was dying. His wife, Catherine, hadn't spoken since yesterday evening, just stared at the stove with something like prayer in her eyes. Thomas had made it to the woodshed once already, midday Wednesday. He'd tied a rope around his waist, tied the other end to his door handle, and walked into white nothing with his arms outstretched. The rope had run out with 10 feet to go, and he'd had to uncouple himself and keep walking, counting steps, praying he was going straight. He'd hit the woodshed wall with his shoulder, loaded his arms until he couldn't carry more, and made the return journey following his own tracks. Except the tracks had already filled with snow, and he'd gotten turned around, and he'd wandered in circles for 10 minutes before his boot caught the rope lying in the snow. He'd followed it back to his door with his arms shaking and his face numb. That had been yesterday. Today the rope was buried, and the woodshed was invisible, and Thomas sat at his table trying to decide if he should risk it. Similar scenes were playing out across the valley. Samuel Dietrich's family was warm, but only because his 4 sons were taking turns making the 70-foot journey to their woodpile, always with ropes, always in pairs. They'd already had one close call when the younger boys had lost sight of each other at midday, found each other by shouting over the wind. Robert McKenna had his rope system, cabin to barn, and he was following it religiously, though each trip took 15 minutes and left him exhausted. Margaret Caulfield in town had guests stranded in her boarding house and was burning furniture to conserve the woodpile. The blizzard blew through Thursday night without letting up. Friday morning brought negative 41 degrees and wind that made the temperature feel worse. Ingrid's daughter asked if the storm would ever end, and Ingrid told her what her grandmother in Norway had once said. Weather always ends. The question is whether you're still there when it does. She kept the fireplace fed, kept the cabin at 68 degrees, kept herself and Anna alive without any particular drama. The chickens laid eggs. The cow produced milk. The horses stood placid in their stalls. Every few hours, Ingrid walked the interior corridor and checked her animals, and every few hours she loaded more firewood from the stack that never got wet and never required her to step into killing cold. But here's what she'd also built that nobody had understood: redundancy. The double-walled construction on the south end meant that even if one wall failed, the firewood stayed protected. The raised platform meant that if water somehow got in, the wood wouldn't sit in it. The ventilation system meant moisture from the animals didn't condense on the wood and rot it. She'd thought through every failure point, and she'd built backups for her backups. This wasn't revolutionary thinking. This was old thinking, the kind that had kept people alive in harsh climates for centuries. The Sami people in northern Scandinavia had been building connected structures for generations, keeping reindeer close to living quarters through winter darkness. The Ainu people in Hokkaido had done similar things with their livestock and food storage. Mongolian herders had developed gears that could be expanded to include animal enclosures during extreme weather. Ingrid hadn't invented anything. She just remembered what her ancestors had known and adapted it to Montana conditions. The wind changed on Saturday, veering from northwest to straight north, driving snow into drifts that reached the eaves on some cabins. The temperature climbed to -28, which felt practically warm by comparison. Visibility improved slightly, enough to see shapes but not details. Ingrid looked out her window and saw nothing but white shapes that might have been trees or might have been snow formations. She fed her fire, fed her daughter, fed her animals. The routine had become almost meditative. Chen Wei, her former construction partner, had stayed in town when the storm hit. He shared a room with 2 other Chinese workers above the general store, and they'd pooled their resources to buy firewood at inflated emergency prices. The store owner, a man named Peterson, had been making a fortune selling fuel to desperate people who hadn't prepared properly. Chen had watched the prices climb and thought about Ingrid's design. He'd thought it was strange when they'd built it. Now he thought it was genius. Like this video if you believe in preserving practical wisdom over popular opinion. The crisis point came Saturday evening. Thomas Brennan's wood had run out. He'd stretched his supply as long as possible, burning green wood and bark and anything else combustible. His fire had died at 4 o'clock, and by 6 the cabin temperature had dropped below freezing. His youngest son, the 4-year-old named Patrick, had started turning blue around the lips. Catherine had wrapped all 3 boys in every blanket and coat they owned, but body heat only went so far when the walls themselves radiated cold. Thomas made his decision at sunset. He told Catherine he was going for wood, said he'd be back in 10 minutes. She'd grabbed his arm, begged him to wait until morning, but morning meant watching his children freeze. He'd kissed her, kissed his boys, and stepped out the door into twilight and blowing snow. He'd lasted 4 minutes. They'd found him in April, 17 feet from his cabin door, frozen in mid-step with his arms reaching toward where he thought the woodshed was. He'd gotten turned perpendicular to his intended direction and walked toward empty prairie instead. The cold had taken him before he'd realized his mistake. Catherine had heard him leave but hadn't heard him return. She'd waited by the door for an hour, calling his name, but the wind had swallowed her voice. Eventually, she'd understood, and she'd bundled the boys tighter and prayed for dawn. The cabin temperature had dropped to 12 degrees by midnight. Patrick had stopped shivering, which was a bad sign. Children died when they stopped shivering. Margaret Caulfield had taught Catherine some things about survival before she'd married. She'd said, "If you're ever dying of cold, burn the structure. Burn your chairs, your table, your walls if you have to. You can rebuild. You can't resurrect." Catherine had started burning furniture at 1 in the morning. She'd broken up chairs with an axe, fed them piece by piece into the stove. She'd burned her wedding chest by 3 o'clock. She'd been eyeing the table when dawn finally came and Samuel Dietrich had arrived with his sons and spare wood. Robert McKenna had fared better, but not by much. His rope system had worked, barely. He'd made the trip to his barn 3 times on Saturday, and each time the journey had taken longer. The cold was getting to him, slowing his movements, clouding his thinking. On his 3rd trip, he'd become disoriented halfway back and nearly lost his grip on the rope. His hands had been too numb to feel it properly. He'd stood in the wind, holding what he thought was the rope, and realized after 30 seconds that he was just holding his own numb fingers together. The rope was gone. He'd panicked, stumbled, fell, and his face had hit something hard in the snow. The rope. He'd grabbed it with both arms and hauled himself along it like a drowning man reaching shore. His wife, Clara, had met him at the door. She'd taken one look at his face, the white patches on his cheeks and nose, and started packing snow on the frostbite while he protested that he was fine. He wasn't fine. The frostbite would leave scars, and the scars would remind him for the rest of his life that his practical separation of structures had nearly killed him. Samuel Dietrich's family had stayed warm, but they'd burned through 2 weeks of firewood in 3 days. His sons were exhausted from the constant trips to the woodpile, and Dietrich himself had developed a cough from the repeated exposure. They'd survive, but they'd learned something about the cost of conventional wisdom. Sunday brought the first break. The wind died around noon, and the snow stopped by evening. The temperature climbed to -15, almost balmy. People emerged from their cabins like animals after hibernation, blinking at the sudden silence, assessing damage. The valley had lost 7 people in 3 days. Thomas Brennan, an elderly man named Yortsburg who'd lived alone. A woman named Susan Hayes who'd been 9 months pregnant and had gone into labor during the storm while her husband was trapped in town. She'd bled to death with no help available. Her husband had returned to find her frozen with the baby. 2 children in separate families, one from cold, one from smoke inhalation after a chimney fire. A traveling preacher who'd been caught between settlements and had tried to wait out the storm in his wagon. Ingrid emerged on Monday morning. She'd lost nothing. She'd never been at risk. She'd lived through 3 days of the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade, and her biggest hardship had been cabin fever from staying inside. Her firewood stack was down by exactly the amount she'd used. Her animals were healthy. Her daughter was playing with a rag doll by the fireplace, completely unaware that children had died 3 miles away. The valley learned about Thomas Brennan first, because his place was closest to Dietrich's claim. They'd found Catherine and the boys still alive, barely, and brought them to recover. They'd searched for Thomas and found his body after an hour. Word spread quickly. Margaret Caulfield heard about it Tuesday and rode out to Ingrid's place without stopping. She'd arrived at noon, dismounted, and stood looking at the structure. Inside, Ingrid made coffee, set out bread. Margaret sat at the table in silence. Finally, "How much wood did you use?" "About 4 cords, maybe less." "How many trips outside?" "None." Margaret nodded slowly. "Thomas Brennan is dead. Susan Hayes and her baby are dead. 2 children are dead. An old man is dead. A preacher is dead." She paused. "And you're sitting here drinking coffee." "I know," Ingrid said quietly. "Samuel came by this morning." "You weren't foolish," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "Everyone else was. We've been building wrong for 12 years. Robert McKenna came by on Wednesday with his face bandaged. He'd brought lumber, offered to help Ingrid with anything she needed built, insisted he owed her. She'd said she didn't understand why. He'd said, "Because I called your design a coffin, and it turns out I was the one building coffins. Mine just looked more conventional." Chen Wei visited on Thursday with 3 other Chinese workers from town. They'd asked to see the interior structure, the firewood storage, the animal arrangement. They'd taken notes. 2 of them were planning to file homestead claims in the spring, and they wanted to build the same way. Chen had looked at Ingrid with something like respect and said, "You remembered old ways. This is good. Old ways kept people alive before we forgot why they worked." Samuel Dietrich came Friday with his whole family. His sons had carried tools, prepared to work. Dietrich had stood in Ingrid's cabin and said, "I need to rebuild my woodshed. I'd like to build it attached to my cabin, like you did here. I'd like to hire you to consult on the design." His voice had carried humility and exhaustion, and something like shame. "I told you that you were building wrong. I need to say that I'm sorry, and I need to ask for your help. This is the story that matters." Not that Ingrid Halvorsen built an unusual structure, but that she'd thought clearly about the actual problems she faced instead of building what everyone else said was correct. The conventional wisdom in Montana Territory in the 1880s was that you separated your structures for safety and hygiene. That wisdom killed people. Not directly, not obviously, but it killed them by creating a deadly gap between heat and fuel, between safety and survival. Ingrid's design solved that problem by eliminating the gap. She'd combined her shelter and storage into one integrated unit where every element supported the others. The animal heat warmed the structure. The structure protected the animals. The firewood stayed dry and accessible. The hay storage provided insulation overhead. The double walls prevented heat loss. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was vulnerable to the one thing that killed most settlers, the inability to reach what they needed when they needed it. The mathematics were straightforward. In conventional construction, a settler might need to make 15 to 20 trips outside during a 3-day blizzard to maintain adequate firewood supplies. Each trip lasted 10 to 30 minutes depending on conditions and distance. Each trip risked disorientation, frostbite, exhaustion. The cumulative risk across a winter was substantial. Studies done years later by agricultural researchers showed that settlers using separated structures faced 4 to 7 times the injury risk and twice the mortality rate compared to integrated designs in severe weather conditions. Ingred's approach reduced exterior trips to 0 during storms. The energy savings alone were significant. Walking through a 35-degree barn corridor required minimal protective clothing and 0 acclimatization time. She could check her animals, gather fuel, collect eggs, and return to warmth in less time than it took to put on a heavy coat. Over a winter, this saved approximately 200 hours of labor and eliminated exposure to life-threatening cold. But the real advantage wasn't efficiency, it was resilience. When Thomas Brennan's situation deteriorated, he'd faced a binary choice: risk death by going outside or guarantee death by staying inside. Ingrid had never faced that choice because her design had eliminated the dilemma. Her fuel was always accessible. Her survival was never contingent on gambling against weather. She'd built margin into her existence, and that margin had proven to be the difference between life and death. The valley rebuilt after the blizzard. By spring of 1884, 11 families had modified their structures following Ingrid's approach. Samuel Dietrich constructed an attached woodshed and covered walkway. Robert McKenna rebuilt entirely. Margaret Caulfield added an enclosed corridor between her kitchen and wood storage. Chen Wei and 4 other Chinese workers filed claims together and built a communal structure. Not everyone adapted. Some settlers kept conventional designs, argued the blizzard had been an anomaly. 3 of those families didn't survive the following winter. Ingrid lived on her claim until 1911. She eventually married Chen Wei in 1887, which caused minor scandal, but nobody interfered. They raised Anna together and had 2 more children. They expanded the original structure twice, always maintaining the integrated design. Other settlers came to them for advice. Anna Halverson grew up to become a teacher in Bozeman, and she spent 40 years documenting frontier survival techniques before they were forgotten. She wrote extensively about her mother's building methods and interviewed dozens of families who'd adopted integrated designs. Her papers, donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1956, contained detailed drawings and measurements of structures that kept families alive during the brutal winters of the 1880s and 90s. Researchers studying historical architecture and sustainable building practices still reference her work. Modern passive house design, which emphasizes thermal mass, integrated space, and minimal energy loss, essentially rediscovered principles that Ingrid and others had figured out through necessity. Contemporary architects building for extreme climates in Alaska, northern Canada, and Scandinavia often use layouts that echo her horseshoe design. Living quarters backed by storage and livestock areas, everything under one roof, fuel always accessible. The advantage of never going outside to reach critical supplies remains as relevant in the 21st century as it was in 1883. The original Halverson structure stood until 1943, when it was dismantled to salvage lumber for the war effort. By then, it had housed 3 generations and survived 60 Montana winters without major failure. The stone foundation remained visible until the 1970s, when modern development finally erased it. But photographs exist, and Anna's drawings exist, and the technique itself spread far enough that examples can still be found across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Modest structures that look slightly odd because they don't conform to conventional separation of barn and dwelling, but which kept their occupants alive when conventional structures killed them. Here's what Ingrid understood that took everyone else a tragedy to learn. Practical wisdom isn't about following established rules. It's about understanding why the rules exist, what problems they solve, and whether those problems are actually the ones you face. The conventional separation of structures in mild climates prevented disease transmission and reduced fire risk. Those were real concerns. But in Montana territory during blizzard season, the primary threat wasn't disease or fire. It was cold and isolation and the deadly gap between you and your fuel supply. Ingrid addressed the actual threat, not the theoretical one. She'd told Samuel Dietrich once, years after the blizzard, "People in Ohio build for Ohio problems. People in Montana need to build for Montana problems." I didn't invent anything. I just stopped copying buildings that were designed for different weather. That might be the most important lesson here. Not the specific design, not the measurements or materials, but the underlying approach. Observe your actual conditions, identify your actual threats, design your actual solutions. Don't build what looks right. Build what works. If you believe this kind of knowledge should be preserved and passed on, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting frontier techniques and survival wisdom that's being lost as the last generation who learned directly from settlers passes away. Every story we tell is one that won't disappear completely. Every technique we share is one that might help someone a century from now who faces similar problems. Join us in keeping this knowledge alive. The blizzard of 1883 killed 7 people in one valley in Montana Territory. It could have killed more. It would have killed more if one Norwegian widow hadn't thought clearly about the actual problem she faced and built accordingly. She didn't build for comfort or convention or what looked proper to her neighbors. She built for survival in conditions that didn't forgive mistakes. And when the test came, when the temperature dropped below -40 and the wind made it impossible to see your own hands, her design proved itself in the most fundamental way possible. Everyone inside it lived. That's the standard. Not whether something looks right or follows tradition or makes sense to people who've never faced your specific challenges. The standard is, does it keep you alive when everything is trying to kill you? Ingrid's barn over her cabin met that standard. Most conventional structures didn't. 7 graves proved the difference. Remember that the next time someone tells you you're building wrong, they might be right, or they might be building for different problems than the ones you actually face. The difference between those two possibilities is sometimes measured in degrees Fahrenheit and feet of snow, and whether you're still there when spring comes. Ingrid Halvorsen was there, Thomas Brennan wasn't. The only difference was the building between them and the cold. That's the whole story. Weather came. 7 people died. One woman lived because she'd built for the reality of Montana winter instead of the expectations of Montana neighbors. There's your practical wisdom. There's your frontier innovation. There's your lesson from 1883 that still applies in 2025. Solve the actual problem you face, not the theoretical problem someone else faced somewhere else. Build for your conditions, design for your threats, and keep your firewood dry during the blizzard, whatever form that blizzard takes.